The sun hung mercilessly above the small southern town, bleaching the paint from rooftops and drawing long, harsh shadows across the sidewalks. It was the kind of heat that slowed even the most energetic children, pressing the streets into a restless silence. Yet, beneath the stillness, the town pulsed with unease. The heat was not only in the air, it was in the people, simmering under the surface, threatening to boil over. Every street bore the marks of division, though no signs officially declared it. The separation was understood, unwritten, and fiercely enforced by habit and hostility. On one side of town, broad porches shaded whitewashed houses, their yards trimmed neat as if to prove their order and superiority. On the other, narrow lanes twisted between shotgun shacks, yards scattered with tin toys, and wash lines hung heavy with clothing. Children in both neighborhoods played, but they never played together. The gulf between them was wider than geography. It was a barrier built from history, law, and fear. The center of the town was dominated by the courthouse, its proud white columns standing like guards at attention. To the townspeople who enforced the status quo, the courthouse was a symbol of stability, a fortress of law and order. But to others, it was a wall of stone that loomed over them, casting shadows on their rights, reminding them daily of the limits set on their freedom. The courthouse lawn was manicured in green, but for some, walking across it felt like trespassing into a world that didn't belong to them. Downtown, the same division extended to every shop and diner. The cafe on Main Street served tall glasses of sweet tea and thick slices of pie, but only to certain customers. To others, the doorway was as closed as a locked vault. At the drugstore, the soda fountain stools gleamed with polish, but not every child could climb up and taste the milkshakes. Even the public library, filled with dusty books that seemed to belong to everyone, was not a place everyone was allowed to linger. The invisible lines were clear, and those who crossed them risked more than scorn. They risked punishment. Yet, in kitchens and living rooms behind drawn curtains, the whispers of change had begun. Radios crackled with voices from outside the town, voices of preachers, activists, and leaders who spoke of justice, equality, and the power of standing together. Those messages did not fall on deaf ears. They planted themselves like seeds in weary hearts, giving people the courage to imagine something different. Hope was dangerous in such a place, but it was also contagious. At the same time, fear stalked the streets like a shadow no one could outrun. Those in power, sheriffs, store owners, city officials, watched the shifting atmosphere with suspicion. They tightened their grip, doubling their rules and reminding anyone who dared to speak of change what consequences awaited. Patrol cars circled neighborhoods at night, their lights sweeping through windows like spotlights on a stage. Arrests came swift and sometimes without explanation. Fear was meant to silence. Yet the silence was cracking. The town's children, often shielded from adult concerns, could not help but notice. They heard their parents lower their voices when certain names were mentioned. They saw neighbors hauled away in handcuffs. They watched as their parents paused in doorways, glancing at the courthouse before crossing the street. To a child's eyes, the world was divided not only by sidewalks and fences, but by a heavy, invisible tension that made even ordinary days feel fragile. That summer, the sense of anticipation grew heavier. Some residents prayed for calm, hoping nothing would disturb their orderly lives. Others prayed for disruption, for something bold enough to break the chains that bound them. Rumors spread quickly, rumors of marches, of boycotts, of meetings being held in secret. Some dismissed them as idle talk. Others prepared for what they knew was coming. And so, the town existed in a state of waiting. Waiting for the next spark, waiting for the next command, waiting for the day when silence could no longer be mistaken for peace. Even those who claimed not to care felt the charge in the air. It was in the narrowed eyes of store owners, the hushed prayers in church pews, and the restless pacing of policemen outside the station. On the surface, the streets appeared calm. Children rode bicycles. Shopkeepers swept dust from their doorsteps. Dogs barked from porches. But beneath the routine was a storm that had not yet broken. The marchers who would soon step onto those streets were already gathering courage in their hearts. The officers who would soon line up with their dogs were already preparing themselves for confrontation. And in one small house on the quieter side of town, a little girl played with her doll, blissfully unaware that she would soon become the spark in a moment that would ripple far beyond the courthouse lawn. The town was divided, but the divide was not unmovable. It trembled under the weight of possibility, waiting for one small act to expose its fragility. And in that sweltering summer heat, with tension coiled tight around every street corner, the smallest voice was about to prove stronger than the loudest growl. The air on that afternoon was heavy, thick with both humidity and anticipation. The cicadas droned in the trees, their relentless song echoing the restlessness in human hearts. Word had spread quietly through kitchens, churches, and backyards. Today they would march. Not everyone believed it was wise. Some feared the consequences, others feared the police, and many feared for their children. Yet when the time came, feet began to gather, hesitant at first, then with purpose, in the parking lot of a small church at the edge of town. The church was modest, with peeling white paint and a roof patched more than once. But within its walls, songs of courage had been sung, prayers whispered with trembling voices, and plans made under the cover of night. That morning, its pews filled with men in their work shirts, women in Sunday dresses, and children clinging to their mothers' skirts. Some carried signs hastily painted with words like freedom, now, and we shall overcome. Others carried nothing but the steady fire in their eyes. When the pastor rose, his voice carried over the crowd, calm but commanding. He did not preach that day with lofty words. Instead, he spoke plainly, as one neighbor to another. He reminded them of why they had come, not to fight with fists, not to shout with anger, but to walk side by side until their very presence demanded to be seen. "We are not here to stir trouble," he said, his hand pressed firmly to the pulpit. "We are here because dignity is ours, and no law, no man, can take it away." The congregation answered not with cheers, but with a low hum of agreement. They knew what awaited them. They had seen the nightsticks, the dogs, the fire hoses in other towns. Some had even felt the sting of those weapons themselves. But today, they would not stay hidden. They would step out into the heat and claim the street as their own. Families moved as clusters, mothers shepherding their children into the line, fathers gripping their sons' shoulders with a silent command to stand tall. There was fear in every pair of eyes, but also determination. A woman in her 60s leaned on a cane, insisting she would walk even if it was her last march. A teenage boy, hardly older than 16, carried a sign so big it nearly dwarfed him. Their differences in age, in strength, in circumstance did not matter. On this day, they were united. The first step was always the hardest. The doors of the church opened wide, and the marchers spilled out into the glaring sun. Shoes scuffed against gravel. Children squinted against the light, and adults adjusted their grip on homemade placards. The sound of their footsteps was uneven at first, like an uncertain drumbeat. Then, as they reached the road, they began to fall into rhythm. Their steps became one sound, one body, one purpose dot as they walked. Hymns rose up, not shouted, but sung with quiet strength. Voices carried lines of songs older than any of them, songs their grandparents had sung in fields, songs born out of suffering, but carried forward with hope. The music steadied their nerves, gave shape to their fear, and turned their march into something larger than themselves. The harmony floated down the street, curling into alleys, slipping through windows. and reaching the ears of those who watched in silence. Not everyone cheered. Some onlookers stood on porches, arms crossed, eyes cold, as they muttered under their breath. A few shouted insults, spitting venom meant to shake the marchers' resolve. Children clung tighter to their mothers when the words rang out, but the songs never faltered. One man hurled a can from his yard. It clattered on the pavement, but no one broke stride. Their silence in the face of hostility was louder than any insult hurled at them, that others watched with quiet awe. From behind half-closed curtains and cracked doors, neighbors peered out. Some had not dared to join, but they could not look away. For them, the sight of the marchers, ordinary men and women transformed into a river of resolve, was both humbling and convicting. Change was walking down their very street, and it was impossible to deny its presence. Among the marchers, children played a peculiar role. Too young to fully understand, they clutched their parents' hands, eyes wide at the solemn songs and stern faces. But their presence was itself a message. Parents brought them not to shield them from danger, but to show them that courage was an inheritance, passed from one generation to the next. If they had to suffer for dignity, they would not suffer alone. Their children would witness, and in witnessing, they would remember. The longer they marched, the heavier the air seemed to grow. Every corner they turned brought them closer to the courthouse, and with it, closer to the line of men who would stand waiting. Yet no one turned back. Each step was an act of defiance, each song a prayer carried on the wind. The fear was real, faces were pale, hands trembled, but the collective will was stronger than the dread of what lay ahead. One young woman near the front clutched her sign so tightly that splinters dug into her palms. She thought of her brother, jailed for refusing to step aside at a bus station. She thought of her mother, forced to clean houses, but never allowed to sit at the tables she polished. Every ache in her body, every throb of her blistered feet, was a reminder of why she walked. She did not see herself as brave. She saw herself as necessary. Behind her, an elderly man hummed with every step. His voice cracked, but he hummed anyway, his lips moving to a tune his father had taught him in another century. To him, the march was not only about this day, this town, this struggle. It was about all the days before when dignity had been stolen, and all the days ahead when freedom might finally arrive. His slow, steady pace lent strength to those around him, as if he carried the weight of history on his shoulders. By the time they reached the heart of town, the marchers had become something more than a group of individuals. They were a single body, a living force, a testament to endurance. Their shoes scuffed the pavement, their songs rose in harmony, and their signs swayed in the sticky breeze. What began as a gathering in a humble church had transformed into a movement that filled the streets. And yet, as they neared the courthouse square, their voices softened. The songs fell into murmurs, the footsteps slowed. In the distance, they saw the line badges glinting in the sun, uniforms crisp, dogs straining against their leashes. The reality of confrontation loomed large. Parents gripped their children's hands tighter. Men shifted their weight nervously. Women pressed trembling lips together. But still, not a single marcher broke away. They had come too far to turn back. This was the moment they had prepared for, the moment they had feared, the moment they had dreamed of. They would not retreat. With every step forward, they declared without words that dignity was worth the risk. The marchers pressed on, carrying their songs, their signs, their trembling hearts, and an unshakable truth. The world would never be the same after today. The courthouse square stretched wide before the marchers, a flat expanse of pavement that left no room to hide. The sun beat down harder here, reflecting off windows and casting sharp shadows against the columns. To the marchers, it felt less like open space and more like a stage, as if every eye in town, whether sympathetic, hostile, or indifferent, was fixed upon them. And waiting at the far end of that stage stood the line. The officers had arrived long before the marchers, their patrol cars positioned at the edges of the square like barriers. They had not gathered in disorder. They had arranged themselves in a perfect wall of uniforms, a row of blue and gray, shoulders squared and chins lifted. Their boots scuffed the ground with restless precision. From their belts hung batons polished by use, handcuffs clinking with every shift in stance. On their chests, the metal of their badges gleamed so brightly that some marchers squinted when they caught the sun's reflection. But it was not the officers alone who commanded attention. At their feet strained the dogs, large, muscular beasts bred for control and intimidation. Their coats shone in the light, their mouths open to reveal sharp teeth glistening with saliva. Some paced, dragging their handlers forward. Others crouched low, growls rumbling from deep within their chests. The sound of those growls carried across the square, sinking into the bones of those who heard them. It was a sound designed to provoke fear, primal and undeniable. The handlers held the leashes taut, knuckles white as they tightened their grip. Their faces betrayed little, but their eyes revealed the tension of men caught between authority and unease. They had been told they were the line of defense, that order depended on their strength. They wore that duty heavily, clinging to it like armor. Some officers set their jaws, eager to assert dominance. Others shifted their weight from one foot to the other, uneasy about what might come. Yet together, they presented an image of unyielding power. For the marchers, the sight was both expected and unbearable. They had imagined it in whispers, prepared themselves in prayer, and yet, seeing it with their own eyes, was something else entirely. Mothers pulled children closer, gripping small hands with desperate strength. Men at the front swallowed hard, feeling their throats tighten as the growls echoed. A few marchers faltered in their step, slowing as instinct begged them to stop. But no one turned back. The wall of uniforms and snarling dogs was terrifying, but retreat would have been worse. Retreat would have been surrender. The songs that had carried them this far wavered. The voices faltered, not with defeat, but with awe at the confrontation now before them. A hymn that had moments earlier filled the street now sounded like a fragile thread against the backdrop of snarls and commands barked from officers. Still, even a faint song was a defiance, and they clung to it. Their words shook, but they did not fall silent. Tension coiled tightly in the square, wrapping itself around every heart. Onlookers leaned forward from porches and store windows, holding their breath. Some smirked with satisfaction, convinced the marchers would scatter. Others prayed silently that courage would hold. Even those who had sworn they didn't care about the protest found themselves rooted in place, unable to look away. It felt as though time itself had slowed, stretching every second into an eternity. A child's whimper rose from somewhere deep in the crowd, quickly hushed by a mother's hand. An elderly man steadied himself on a cane, whispering prayers under his breath. A teenager gripped his sign until his knuckles blanched, the wood biting into his palms. The air was thick with fear, but beneath it ran a current of determination. The marchers' steps may have slowed, but they had not stopped. Across the line, the officers held their ground, but their silence was not passive. Commands murmured through clenched teeth. Hold the line. Don't let them through. Keep the dogs ready. Their words were curt, rehearsed, like soldiers repeating orders before battle. Every man knew the image they had to maintain. Authority unshaken, dominance unquestioned. Yet some of their eyes darted nervously, betraying the cracks beneath the mask. The dogs, however, needed no such orders. They sensed the fear, the sweat, the trembling voices, and responded instinctively. They lunged forward, pulling hard on their chains, teeth snapping at the air. Their barks erupted like thunderclaps, echoing off the courthouse walls and rattling the nerves of even the bravest marcher. Every bark was a reminder that these animals had been trained not merely to intimidate, but to attack. Square became a battlefield without weapons drawn. On one side stood men, women, and children, armed only with songs and placards. On the other stood officers and dogs, their authority wrapped in teeth and steel. Neither side advanced, but the confrontation was alive, tense, like a storm gathering force. The outcome was uncertain, but one truth was undeniable. Something was going to break, and yet, amid the growls and stares, there was also silence, an unnerving silence that pressed down harder than the heat. No one spoke loudly. No one dared to shout. The marchers' songs wavered into murmurs. The officers barked only occasional commands. The dogs snarled, filling the void with their feral warning. That silence was the most dangerous part, for it suggested that the smallest spark of misstep, a sudden move, even a word could ignite chaos. For the children in the march, the police line looked like a wall of giants. Their young minds struggled to understand why men with badges would bring animals to face families. To them, it felt unfair, almost surreal, like stepping into a nightmare. They clung tighter to their parents, their wide eyes fixed on the dogs. For some, tears threatened to fall. For others, a strange curiosity kept them staring, trying to make sense of the hostility. Every heartbeat in the square was a drumbeat of suspense. Would the officers give the order? Would the dogs be unleashed? Would the marchers hold? The questions hung heavy in the air, but no answers came. Both sides stood locked in a moment that stretched impossibly long, as though the world itself was holding its breath. And then, without warning, the marchers' forward movement stopped completely. They stood just a few yards from the dogs, close enough to see the saliva drip from their fangs, close enough to smell the musky mix of sweat and fur. The line between them was no longer invisible. It was tangible, living, breathing, and growling. It was a line drawn not on paper, but in fear and defiance. For the officers, it was a test of control. For the marchers, it was a test of faith. For the town, it was a test of conscience. And in that unbearable silence, in the shadow of snarling dogs and shining badges, everyone knew that this was more than a standoff. This was a reckoning. What none of them could have foreseen was that it would not be a baton, a shout, or even a dog that shattered the silence. It would be something far smaller, far simpler, a child's voice, a pair of words. But that moment had not yet come. For now, the square held steady, locked in a fragile balance, waiting for the act that would tilt history on its axis. The square held its breath, suspended between fury and faith, when movement stirred not from the officers nor the marchers, but from somewhere unexpected low in the crowd, near the hem of her mother's dress. A little girl, no more than 7, tugged at her mother's hand with a stubbornness only a child could possess. Her mother bent low, whispering urgently, her face tight with fear. "Stay close, baby. Don't let go." But the child's eyes were fixed ahead, not on the crowd, not on her mother's trembling grip, but on the dogs. Those restless creatures, snarling and snapping, seemed to command her attention, as if calling her forward. The girl's braids swung gently as she stepped from her mother's side. For a heartbeat, no one noticed. The crowd's eyes were fixed on the officers' eyes on the marchers, and the dogs on everyone at once. But then, a space opened, just enough for the girl's small body to slip through. She moved as though drawn by something unseen, something larger than herself. Gasps rose as parents reached, too late, to pull her back. A murmur rolled through the marchers. Fear surged like lightning. What would happen if the dogs lunged? What would the officers do? Her mother cried her name, the sound sharp and desperate, but the child did not turn. Step by step, she crossed the invisible line between the crowd and the officers. Her small shoes tapped softly against the hot pavement, a sound almost drowned out by the growling. Yet in that charged silence, it carried farther than anyone expected. The growls deepened as the dogs sensed her nearness, their bodies taut, chains rattling as they strained forward. The handlers tightened their grips, pulling back hard, unsure whether to hold or prepare for release. The girl stopped just a few feet from the line. She was so small, the badges on the officers' chests seemed impossibly high above her. Her wide eyes darted, not in terror but in wonder, as though trying to puzzle out why grown men needed such fierce animals to stand guard. The sun caught her face, highlighting the innocence that no fear could erase. She pointed her tiny hand rising, finger steady despite the trembling all around her. Her gaze locked on one of the largest dogs, a German shepherd with a chest like iron and eyes blazing with intensity. The crowd stiffened, horrified that her gesture might provoke the beast. And then, in a voice soft but piercing in the silence, she spoke two words, "Puppy dog." The words were simple, childish, almost playful. But they fell into the square like stones into still water, rippling outward, impossible to contain. For an instant, time fractured. The marchers froze, jaws parted in disbelief. The officers blinked, as though trying to confirm what they had heard. Even the handlers faltered, their grips slackening ever so slightly. The dog's growl faltered, caught in its throat. Its ears twitched, its head tilted, confusion flickering across its trained menace. The chain jingled softly as it stopped pulling forward, sniffing instead at the air between itself and the girl. Whispers swept through the crowd. "Did you hear her? What did she say? Lord, have mercy." Mothers pressed their hands to their mouths. Fathers shook their heads in stunned awe. Children stared with wide eyes, trying to understand how such a small voice could still the storm. The officers exchanged glances, their stern facades cracking. One shifted uncomfortably, as though unsure whether to laugh or scowl. Another muttered beneath his breath, "She called it a puppy." The absurdity of it, the innocence of it, gnawed at their authority. How could they unleash fury on a child who saw only a pet where others saw a weapon? The girl, unshaken by the tension she had shattered, kept her finger raised. "Puppy dog," she repeated, as if reminding them of something they had all forgotten, that beneath the snarls and uniforms and orders, there was a world simpler, kinder, truer than this one. The dog sat not. It was not obedience to its handler's tug, nor to any command barked from the line. It sat because the child's eyes had met its own, not with fear, but with recognition. Its tongue lolled briefly, panting in the heavy heat, the growl replaced by a low, uncertain whine. The handler cursed under his breath, yanking the chain, but the beast resisted, not out of defiance, but confusion. The child had named it differently, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed to believe her. The square erupted not in chaos, but in astonishment. Gasps turned to murmurs, murmurs to shouts. Some laughed nervously, the sound edged with disbelief. Others cried openly, overwhelmed by the impossible tenderness of what they had just witnessed. Songs flared again, trembling but strong, voices rising as though emboldened by the innocence that had cut through the fear. The officers struggled to regain control. "Step back." One barked, his voice sharp, but it wavered. Another reached for the girl, only to hesitate, unsure if touching her would make the moment worse. Authority was slipping, not because the marchers had advanced, but because a child had seen their weapons and called them something else. Her mother pushed forward at last, weaving desperately through the crowd, tears streaking her face. She swept her daughter into her arms, clutching her tight as though to shield her from the world's cruelty. "Baby, don't you ever." But her words broke into sobs, her relief too great to be scolded. The girl, still calm, rested her head on her mother's shoulder, her finger still pointing weakly toward the dog, as though unwilling to let go of her discovery. The dog barked once, but it was no longer the same Mark. It was uncertain, almost playful, as though caught between the orders it had been trained to follow and the innocence it had just encountered. The handler jerked its chain angrily, dragging it back into line, but the moment had already slipped from his grasp. The damage, or perhaps the healing, was done, and in that fragile pause, the entire town felt something shift. The marchers straightened, their fear tempered by awe. The officers fumbled, their confidence cracked. The bystanders whispered to one another, unable to deny what they had seen. It was not victory, not yet, but it was a glimpse of something beyond fear, beyond hatred. A reminder that innocence, once spoken aloud, could unmake even the most carefully constructed wall of power. The little girl had not intended to challenge anyone. She had not meant to disrupt the square or disarm the officers. She had only spoken the truth as she saw it. And yet, in that truth lay a power greater than any baton, stronger than any chain. The marchers began to sing again, louder this time. The hymn rose, trembling at first, then swelling until it filled the square, drowning out the dog's barks, overwhelming the officers' silence. The child's 2 words lingered like a refrain beneath their voices, unspoken yet present, reshaping the space between them all. The square had been waiting for a spark. None could have guessed it would come from the smallest among them, spoken with such innocence that even snarling beasts paused to listen. And though the moment passed quickly, like a fragile bubble bursting in the heat, its echo remained in years to come. Many would debate what it meant. Some would dismiss it as coincidence, others as divine intervention. But for those who stood in the square that day, it was undeniable. A child had pointed at a weapon and named it something harmless. And for one breathless instant, the world believed her. The little girl's words had not ended the standoff. They had not dismantled the line of officers or freed the town from its divisions. But they had cracked the silence in a way no adult voice had managed. And once a crack appears, the wall can never be the same. What came next would test that fragile hope. But in that moment, brief, trembling, unforgettable, the balance of fear had shifted. And all because a child had dared to see a puppy dog where others saw a beast. For a long heartbeat after the child's words floated into the summer air, the square seemed paralyzed. No baton swung, no chant rose, no command barked. It was as if the town itself, with all its heat and history, had been caught in suspension. Then the whispers began. They slid quietly through the crowd at first, like the rustling of leaves before a storm. She called it a puppy dog. Did you hear her? Lord, did you hear that, baby? Mothers clutched their children tighter, astonishment widening their eyes. Fathers shook their heads slowly, somewhere between fear and awe. Even the marchers, men and women who had endured insults, hoses and shackles, looked at one another in disbelief. The words were small, innocent, and yet they carried the force of a hammer against glass. 2 words had stripped away the ferocity that the officers had worked so hard to cultivate. For years, the growl of a police dog had been enough to silence voices, scatter crowds, break spirits. But now, a child had looked that menace in the face and declared it something familiar, something harmless. Not monster, not weapon. Puppy Dog. The marchers' hymns, silenced moments earlier, rose again, but this time something had changed. The tone carried less trembling, less desperation. Instead, there was a thread of wonder stitched into their voices. The song swelled like a tide reclaiming the shore. Their voices rose higher than the barking, louder than the clink of chains, filling the courthouse square with something stronger than fear, possibility. Officers shuffled uneasily in their boots. Authority, so carefully displayed in starched uniforms and polished badges, faltered under the weight of a child's unfiltered truth. One officer coughed, another shifted his stance, tugging nervously at his belt. Their dogs, still tense but less certain, panted in the heat, ears flicking toward the sound of singing rather than the urge to lunge. The handlers muttered curses under their breath, but even they could not undo what had been set loose. A dog that had sat down remained seated, its head cocked toward the child, its menace undone. Another growl broke into an uncertain whine, betraying confusion. The officers jerked their leashes harshly, but it was too late. The illusion of control had cracked Dot, and the crowd knew it. Parents who had clutched their children closer now found themselves straightening. The men who had bowed their heads in prayer now lifted them, shoulders squaring with newfound pride. Women who had sung softly now let their voices soar, their hands clapping to the rhythm, as if to drive the song deeper into the marrow of the moment. The marchers began to move not forward yet, but upward, their energy rising as though the child's words had loosened something heavy from their backs. The air buzzed with courage that had seemed impossible minutes earlier. They were no longer staring only at snarling dogs and rigid uniforms. They were staring at the absurdity of power undone by innocence. From the sidelines, townspeople who had not dared to join the march edged closer. Shopkeepers leaned out of doorways, their faces tight with confusion. Housewives who had watched from porches pressed hands to their mouths, wondering how such a fragile voice could shake the line of men who had ruled the streets for so long. "Puppy dog," someone repeated aloud, and laughter burst through the tension, not mocking laughter, but the laughter of relief, of sudden realization. It rippled across the crowd, ragged but unstoppable. In a place where laughter had so often been dangerous, it became a weapon of its own, blunting fear with the sharp edge of defiance. The officers hated that sound. Their jaws tightened, their grips tightened, but their confidence loosened. Nothing in their training manuals had prepared them for this, for the sting of being laughed at by those they were supposed to intimidate. They could handle chance, defiance, even stones. But laughter? Laughter was humiliation. And humiliation, in front of an entire town, was something no badge could shield them from. One officer barked, "Quiet down." His voice cracked like a whip, but instead of silence, the crowd answered with louder singing, stronger clapping, freer laughter. Another shouted, "Disperse now." But no one moved. Their legs, once frozen by fear, now rooted themselves firmly to the ground. It was as if two words had turned their shoes to stone unshakable. Immovable Dot the child, still nestled in her mother's arms, blinked curiously at the eruption she had caused. She did not understand why grown men with guns and dogs seemed smaller now, why the people around her were smiling through their tears. She only knew she had said what she saw, and somehow it had mattered. The song shifted into a hymn, older than the square itself, voices lifting heavenward as though to testify. "This little light of mine?" Someone began, and the refrain spread, taken up by dozens, then hundreds. The officers flinched. That song was more dangerous than any thrown rock, because it carried unity. And unity was what they feared most. Make them stop singing? An officer hissed to his captain. But how? The captain's lips pressed thin. Batons could silence voices for a moment. Dogs could scatter bodies. But how could they erase what the child had done? Her words had slipped past every weapon, pierced every shield, planted themselves in every heart. Even the bystanders who had once doubted the marchers now felt it. Some who had whispered against them, who had feared rocking the boat, now leaned forward with a strange mix of shame and hope. If a child could stand against snarling dogs, could they not find the courage to stand too? The sheriff barked another order, his voice sharp as broken glass. But when the dogs failed to lunge, when their own bodies betrayed hesitation, the line of authority looked less like a wall and more like a crumbling fence. The townspeople saw it, the marchers saw it, and the officers themselves, though they would never admit it, felt it. In the charged silence between him verses, the child's words lingered like a ghost, replayed in every ear. Puppy dog, puppy dog, puppy dog. Each repetition stripped away more fear, more intimidation, until the mighty courthouse square seemed less like a fortress and more like a stage one, where ordinary people could finally play their part. And play it they did. The marchers began to sway as they sang, their rhythm steady, their voices thunderous. Children clapped in time, laughter breaking through the notes. Elders raised their hands skyward, tears streaking their cheeks, not of sorrow, but of recognition. They had waited for a sign, and it had come not in fire or fury, but in the simplest of words from the smallest of mouths. For the officers, the humiliation deepened with every note, every smile, every ripple of laughter. Their carefully crafted theater of dominance had collapsed in the space of a child's breath. Some scowled harder, trying to mask their unease. Others looked down, shame gnawing at them, unwilling to meet the eyes of those they had tried to terrify. But the marchers did not relent. The song rolled like thunder, the laughter rang like bells, and the words echoed like prophecy. Puppy dog, puppy dog. 2 words had shifted the balance, and nothing, not batons, not badges, not even chains, could restore the silence. The moment stretched on, gathering power. And as the sun burned down on the courthouse square, everyone knew that something irreversible had happened. The crowd was no longer a gathering of frightened people. It was a movement, and it had found its spark in the smallest of voices. What had begun as fear had transformed into defiance. What had seemed like intimidation now looked like absurd theater. And what had once been unshakable authority had been cracked, not by force, but by the pure honesty of a child. 2 words had been enough. The courthouse square was still ringing with the voices of the marchers when the first visible crack appeared, not in the crowd, but in the line of authority. The police dogs, so often the centerpiece of intimidation, no longer carried the same menace. One sat awkwardly, tail twitching as though unsure whether to obey its handler or the little girl's innocent declaration. Another turned its head toward the singing, ears flicking, growl reduced to a confused whimper. The officers tugged sharply at their leashes, trying to restore order, but the animals resisted. The handlers cursed under their breath, jerking chains with growing frustration. The beasts were trained to respond to aggression, to tension, to fear. But here, in this strange new current of laughter and song, they faltered. The very tools meant to terrify were betraying hesitation. The crowd noticed. A ripple of recognition passed through the marchers like a current through water. The wall of power was not impenetrable. It could wobble. It could hesitate. It could doubt. And once the wall showed doubt, fear began to slide off the shoulders of those who had carried it for too long. The sheriff barked orders, his face flushed red beneath the brim of his hat. Hold your line. Control your animals. His voice cracked against the rising hymns, but it did not silence them. Instead, the commands only underscored the fragility of the moment. He was shouting not at the crowd, but at his own men, and everyone could hear it. One officer, young enough to still wear the unease of inexperience on his face, shifted from foot to foot. His grip on the leash slipped, and his dog sat down entirely, tongue lolling as though mocking the tension around it. A laugh burst from the crowd, high and bright, piercing through the sheriff's thunder like sunlight through clouds. The young officer flushed deeper, his jaw tight, but his authority had already drained from him. The marchers straightened. A woman in the front row, her Sunday hat tilted just so, lifted her chin higher. A man beside her, who had once been beaten and jailed for less, found his spine stiffen with pride. They saw what the officers feared most: hesitation, And hesitation, once seen, could never be unseen. Behind the police line, some of the town officials, who had gathered to watch the spectacle, began to murmur nervously. They had expected a display of dominance, a clear reminder to the marchers of their place. Instead, they were witnessing something dangerous. Authority unraveling under the weight of innocence. The sheriff, desperate to regain control, lifted his baton and barked another command. "Step back, or you'll be moved." His voice cracked again, betraying the strain in his chest. But the crowd did not step back. They sang louder, stronger, pressing their voices against his command until his words drowned beneath their unity. The officers glanced at one another, and in their eyes flickered something rarely seen on that side of the line: doubt. They were not afraid of the marchers' numbers. They had faced crowds before. They were not afraid of chants or placards. They had silenced them before. But this was something else. A child's words had stripped away the armor of intimidation. And without that armor, their power felt smaller, almost pitiful. The handlers tried again to rile the dogs, yanking harshly at chains, shouting commands. But the animals, sensing the shift in energy, refused to be the instruments of terror they had been made to be. One whimpered, another barked half-heartedly, but none lunged. Their disobedience rang louder than any command. The officers' leashes rattled like chains of a system that no longer held tight. The marchers noticed. They leaned forward, not physically advancing, but spiritually pressing against the line. Their singing was no longer trembling. It was defiant, bold, unwavering. "We shall not be moved," they sang, and the words became prophecy. The sheriff's jaw clenched, his knuckles whitening around the baton. He turned to his men, hissed something low and bitter, but even his officers seemed unwilling. They were caught in a storm of contradictions, trained to enforce, commanded to dominate, yet faced with a crowd that refused to cower and animals that refused to comply. Their silence betrayed what their uniforms could not admit. They no longer believed in the invincibility of their own line. The townspeople who had gathered at the edges of the square saw it too. For years they had watched these officers stride through streets, badges gleaming, dogs snarling, carrying the weight of law and order like a shield. But now, in the glare of the sun, they looked less like protectors of order and more like men out of their depth, men whose weapons had been exposed as fragile. Whispers of disbelief spread among them, tinged with something dangerous. Sympathy for the marchers' doubt, and then came the laughter again. It rose first from the children, unable to contain the absurdity of watching mighty beasts sit like scolded pets. Then from the elders, who recognized in that absurdity a truth they had prayed to see, that fear was never as strong as it pretended to be. Laughter rolled through the crowd, not cruel but liberating, cutting sharper than any chant. The sheriff roared, his face purple with rage. Silence. But his demand was met with more laughter, more singing, more clapping. His words had become empty echoes, bouncing uselessly off walls of courage he could not tear down. An older officer, grizzled and weary, leaned toward the sheriff and muttered something, his eyes darting to the restless townsfolk. The sheriff snarled in response, but his own eyes betrayed the truth. They were losing the square, and in that realization lay the deepest crack of all. Authority is not simply enforced, it is believed. It requires the crowd to accept its inevitability. But that day, in the sweltering heat, belief was slipping. The marchers no longer believed in the invincibility of the badges before them. The dogs no longer believed in their own menace. Even the officers, deep down, no longer believed in themselves. The little girl, still held tightly in her mother's arms, turned her head against her shoulder, eyes half-lidded as though already drifting away from the storm she had stirred. She did not see the cracks she had opened, but the crowd did. And they knew nothing would be the same again. The courthouse loomed behind the officers. its white columns stark against the blazing sky. For decades, it had stood as a symbol of power, unyielding, unquestioned. But on that day, it seemed smaller. Its shadow no longer reached as far. The authority it represented had been shaken, and once shaken, it could never stand quite as tall again. The cracks were not yet collapsed. The sheriff still stood, baton raised. The officers still held their leashes. The law still claimed its power. But everyone in the square could feel the shift. The marchers were no longer simply resisting. They were revealing the weakness of threats, the absurdity of intimidation, the fragility of control. The cracks spread like spiderwebs across glass, silent but undeniable. And though the wall still stood, its strength was an illusion, its days numbered. Authority had shown its seams, and the people had seen through them. And once seen, the cracks could never be unseen. The courthouse square had seen many confrontations, but never one like this. The air, heavy with the heat of the southern sun, carried the weight of centuries of silence, of fear, of enforced submission. Yet on that sweltering afternoon, it trembled with something new. The little girl's words, 2 syllables, simple and unplanned, had ignited a shift so profound that even the walls of the courthouse seemed to lean forward, straining to listen. At first, the change was subtle, almost fragile. A hesitant laugh here, a whispered amen there. But then it spread. It coursed through the crowd like lightning, snapping chains of fear that had been forged over generations. Men and women who had walked with eyes downcast now lifted their heads. Children who had clung to their parents' legs now stood on their own, wide-eyed and grinning. Even the elders, who had lived long enough to see hope crushed too many times, felt something stir in their chests, a spark they thought had been extinguished forever. The marchers began to sing again, not as a chorus of trembling voices, but as a declaration. Their hymn rang out over the square, high and defiant, filling every corner with resonance that no baton could beat down. We shall not be moved. The refrain rolled like thunder, each word hammering against the facade of authority, each note daring the officers to deny the humanity of those before them. The officers, once so assured in their stance, looked less like enforcers and more like men caught in a storm they could not control. Their eyes flicked nervously from one another to the dogs at their feet, to the sheriff's reddening face. They had been trained to face defiance with force. But this was different. Force could scatter bodies, but how could it scatter a truth spoken by a child and sung by 100 voices? The sheriff raised his baton high, his face twisted with fury. For a moment, it seemed as though he might order the charge, unleash the dogs, shatter the fragile magic of the moment with violence. The crowd braced, hearts pounding, breaths caught, but then the hesitation came. It was small, but it was enough. His hand trembled, just enough for the people to see. His baton hovered in the air, heavy as lead, before lowering again to his side. A gasp rippled through the marchers, followed quickly by a cheer. It was not victory, not yet, but it was proof. Proof that the wall of authority could crack. Proof that fear did not rule absolutely. Proof that courage, even from the smallest voice, could force hesitation in the heart of power. The dogs, confused and restless, barked but did not lunge. Their chains rattled without menace. The handlers swore and tugged, but the animals, sensing the shift, remained stubbornly planted. One even lay down in the dust, its tongue lolling as though mocking the tension around it. The crowd erupted again, this time in laughter, pure and unrestrained. Laughter in the face of fear, laughter in the presence of those who had wielded intimidation like a weapon for so long. It was the kind of laughter that healed as it cut, releasing decades of suffocated breath. For the townspeople who had gathered on the edges of the square, The scene was electrifying. Some had come expecting a spectacle of dominance, a quick reminder of order. Instead, they witnessed authority unravel before their eyes. They saw a sheriff trembling, dogs disobedient, marchers emboldened, and a child at the center of it all. And deep down, whether they admitted it aloud or not, they felt the truth. The old order was not invincible. The sheriff barked another command, his voice hoarse, but it was drowned in song. The hymn rolled louder, joined now by clapping hands, stomping feet, even the low hum of bystanders who had not dared to join before. It was as though the entire square had been transformed into a single voice, united by defiance, fortified by innocence. And there, at the heart of it, was the little girl, nestled against her mother's chest, her small hand still pointing. She looked on with quiet curiosity. She did not understand that she had shaken the foundations of power. She did not realize that her words were already rippling outward, destined to be repeated in whispers, in sermons, in speeches. She only knew that she had seen a puppy where others saw a monster, and that she had spoken the truth. The sheriff lowered his baton again, defeated not by violence, but by laughter and song. His men, though still lined up, stood hollow. Their shoulders sagged, their gazes darted away, their leashes slackened in hands that no longer believed in their purpose. Authority, once absolute, had been reduced to performance, and a poor one at that. The moment stretched, long and unforgettable. It was not the kind of moment captured in photographs or headlines, but the kind that etched itself into memory, carried in the bones of those who were there. Years later, people would still say, "I was there when the little girl spoke." They would remember the way the air felt lighter, the way their hearts beat louder, the way the square itself seemed to shift beneath their feet. For the marchers, it was confirmation that the struggle was not in vain. They had come demanding dignity, and in the innocence of a child, they found it reflected back at them. For the officers, it was humiliation they would never fully shake, a reminder that fear alone was never enough to command obedience. For the townspeople, it was a revelation that even the smallest act could ripple through the largest structures of power. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the courthouse lawn, the marchers began to move again, not away, but forward. Not in aggression, but in unity. Their voices rose as they walked, carrying the hymn into the streets, turning the town into their stage. The officers did not move to stop them. They could not. The moment had already slipped from their grasp, and nothing they did could take it back. And so, the courthouse square bore witness to something rare, something unforgettable. Not a battle of fists or batons, not a clash of stones or bullets, but a confrontation where innocence disarmed violence, where laughter cracked authority, where song defeated silence. It was the moment that shook everyone. Long after the crowd dispersed from the courthouse square, the memory of that afternoon lingered like a song that refused to fade. The marchers carried it home in their voices. The bystanders carried it home in their silences. And even the officers carried it home in their uneasy reflections. What had begun as a simple demonstration had been transformed into something larger, something impossible to contain within the boundaries of that small southern town. The little girl, too young to comprehend the magnitude of her action, was tucked into bed that night with her doll clutched tight in her arms. Her mother whispered prayers of gratitude. Her father sat long into the night, staring at the floorboards, and neighbors stopped by their porch to ask after her. Already, the story was taking on a life of its own. She pointed at the dog, they said, and she said, "Bad dog." It seemed like such a small thing, and yet everyone who repeated it felt its weight. In the days that followed, the story spread like wildfire. First, it moved through kitchens and barbershops, through church pews and schoolyards. Then it leapt beyond the town, carried by travelers and journalists who caught whispers of what had happened. Local newspapers, hesitant at first, could not resist the pull of such a striking account. They described it in careful words, but the truth rang louder than their ink. A child had undone fear with innocence, and an entire crowd had found courage in her voice. For the movement, it became more than a story. It became a symbol. Activists invoked it in speeches, preachers wove it into sermons, and organizers retold it at rallies. They spoke of the child who had no weapon but honesty, no strength but purity, and yet had silenced the growls of trained dogs and the threats of hardened men. They reminded their listeners that courage did not always come in grand gestures or mighty battles. It could come in the smallest act of truth. The sheriff, humiliated by the event, tried to erase it from the official record. He forbade his men from mentioning it, pressured the local paper to downplay it, and even considered arresting the girl's parents as an example. But the moment had already slipped beyond his reach. Once a story leaves the lips of the people, no authority can pull it back. He found himself haunted not only by the child's words, but by the way his own baton had trembled in his hand, a memory he could not silence. For the marchers, the legacy was immediate. Where once they had walked with caution, they now walked with pride. Where once they had lowered their voices, they now raised them. The child's act became their rallying cry, a reminder that their struggle was not hopeless, that the structures of oppression could be rattled by something as simple as 2 words. They sang louder, marched farther, endured arrests with greater resolve. They knew the road ahead would still be long, but they also knew they had glimpsed a crack in the wall. Even the town itself was changed. Those who had stood on the sidelines, uncertain or fearful, found themselves unable to forget what they had witnessed. A dog silenced by a child's voice. Officers made small by laughter. A sheriff who faltered before the eyes of his own people. For some, it sparked guilt. For others, it sparked inspiration. But for all, it planted a seed that could not easily be uprooted. Years later, when the movement had marched far beyond that, courthouse square through bus boycotts and lunch counter sit-ins, through jail cells and legislative battles, the story of the little girl still circulated. It appeared in sermons given miles away, in pamphlets printed in distant cities, even in letters sent across oceans to allies who watched the American struggle with hope and concern. The story was retold not always with perfect accuracy. Sometimes the girl was said to be younger, sometimes older, sometimes her words were slightly altered. But the heart of it remained unchanged. A child had spoken, and the world had listened. The girl herself grew up carrying a legacy she had not chosen. For years, people would stop her on the street, smile knowingly, and say, "You're the one, aren't you?" Teachers looked at her with quiet pride. Elders reminded her of what she had done. Strangers shook her hand as if she were a leader. At first, she felt puzzled. She had only spoken what seemed obvious. Later, as she learned the full weight of the times, she began to understand that her innocence had revealed a truth many adults had been too afraid to name aloud. Her parents raised her carefully, reminding her that while her words had mattered, she was still just a child with a whole life to live. They did not want the movement's weight to crush her. Yet, they could not shield her entirely from its embrace. She grew up knowing that her small voice had joined a chorus far greater than herself, a chorus still singing long after the square had quieted. Historians, too, would later write of the event. They described it as a turning point, not in the sense of immediate political change, but in the way it captured the essence of a movement, the belief that truth, spoken without fear, could dismantle even the most terrifying machinery of oppression. Scholars argued over details, debated its exact impact, but they agreed on one point. The story of the little girl belonged to history, not just memory. And yet, perhaps the truest legacy was not in the books or the speeches, but in the everyday lives of those who carried the moment in their hearts. Mothers reminded their children of it when they felt small. Fathers repeated it to sons who doubted their courage. Teachers told it to students, who wondered if their voices mattered. And always, the lesson was the same. Even the smallest truth could change the course of the world. The courthouse still stood, its white columns weathered by years, its lawn still green and manicured. People walked past it, some remembering, others unaware of what had transpired there. The town itself changed slowly, painfully, unevenly, but it did change. The invisible lines of separation that had once seemed unbreakable began to blur. New generations grew up not knowing the same rigid divides, though they carried the echoes of them still. And every so often, when the town gathered to remember its past, someone would tell the story again. They would describe the marchers, the officers, the dogs, the sheriff. They would describe the heat of the day, the tension in the air, the silence before the words. And then they would pause, lean closer, and repeat what the little girl had said. Bad dog. 2 simple words. Yet they had cut through fear like a blade through rope. They had turned a square of intimidation into a stage of courage. They had given a people the strength to laugh when laughter seemed impossible. And they had left a legacy that reached far beyond the courthouse lawn, far beyond the town itself, echoing into history as a reminder that even the smallest voice can shape the world. So it was that a moment, born of innocence, became a movement's treasure. A child's truth became a people's weapon. And the town, once divided by silence and fear, carried forever the memory of the day when the loudest roar was silenced by the softest voice.